Hi, Old Testament class. I hope you were able to get somewhat of a break over our reading week and that you enjoyed your Thanksgiving. This week we talk about the beginnings of Israelite monarchy, but I thought it might be helpful to review a bit about what we were talking about before all that turkey. We've been looking at 4 books in the Old Testament canon: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. We've been calling the books the Deuteronomistic history, following the scholarly argument that these books were edited, twice perhaps, to reflect the viewpoint of the book of Deuteronomy. We've been talking about the double redaction of these books, the idea that they were put together in their literary form first during the reign of the Judean king Josiah, somewhere around 621 BC, and that the collection went through a major edit after the Babylonian exile, or in the Babylonian exile, sometime after 587. We've been focusing on what the writers in the time period of the writing wanted its readers to think about the past. How did someone in exile need to think about Joshua and Judges in order to speak to the needs of their own time and place? That is, we've been looking at historical dimensions. This week, we add some depth and richness to our conversation by asking a related but somewhat different question. This week, we want to ask by what techniques writers create impressions in the minds of readers. What is it that authors actually do to get us to see things their way? How do they pull it off? And so we are going to pay lots of close attention to the way that authors write stories and organize material. How would you find clues to an author's perspective? One method that we've already learned how to use and that you've been practicing is external structure. Think about how external structure, the structure external to a passage, helps you think about the way the author intended that material to be understood. That is, authors shape our impressions by the way they organize material. A good example that we used before was how the story of the Levite's concubine comes near the end of the book of Judges, which is significant in a book that has been organized to show increasing depravity over the period of the Judges. This is the author's way of showing you that the Levite's concubine story is meant to be seen as a horrific example of how poorly the nation was dealing without a king. Another clue, and perhaps even more clear clue to the author's perspective, is seen by using what we call literary analysis. We've already encountered this method, but now we'll be practicing it even more, both to help us understand the documents at hand and also to get you ready for your third and final skill paper. You'll want to look at that document in the resource section entitled Literary Analysis again, and review the different parts of literary analysis that one might undertake, paying attention to the literary setting of a story, to the style of narration and point of view, and particularly this week, we'll focus on the question of characterization. Asking the question not only of what characters are in a text, but by what techniques the author seeks to create our impression of those characters. And so this week we'll use the Deuteronomistic history as a case study, focusing especially on your readings in 1st and 2nd Samuel. We're going to ask this question: what is the Deuteronomistic historian's author, what is his perspective or their perspective on the first 2 kings of Israel and on kingship in general? So what we'll do is to try to use literary analysis to get at this kind of question. And in this video, you'll want to have your biblical text close by, and you may want to stop and start the video so that you can kind of catch up with what we're talking about as we go along. The first thing to notice is that we first learn about kings in 1st and 2nd Samuel. This is here where we learn about the prophet/judge Samuel anointing both Saul and David. So kings actually show up for the first time in 1st and 2nd Samuel. But think about the fact that if the Deuteronomistic history is actually a collection, then we can think about how Joshua and Judges, as volumes 1 and 2 of the collection, have already set us up to think about monarchy. In this way, we're doing external structure, and we're asking the question of how have the earlier chapters or the earlier parts of the story prepared us to see what's going to happen now. So I'll ask you to spend some time thinking about these questions. Think about the book of Joshua. How does the book of Joshua predispose you to think about kings? You might want to think about what a powerful leader Joshua is and how successful he is when he follows the commands to obey Yahweh alone. Is that a positive view of kingship, negative, or perhaps does it provide a model for the perfect king? What about the book of Judges? What has the book of Judges said about kings? How has it led us to prepare for kings? Last time in our video, I talked about how increasingly near the end of the book of Judges, the story keeps saying, it was a time when there was no king in Israel and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It's a good clue, I think, that the books of Joshua and Judges have perhaps set us up to view kingship, at least when it is faithful, as positive. Although you might also want to think about what other stories we found in Joshua and Judges, including the stories of a couple of failed attempts at kingship, such as under the reign of the judge Abimelech. But let's move into 1 Samuel and look at our question. Again, how does the Deuteronomistic historian portray kings and kingship? So I'll ask you to spend a little bit of time with 1 Samuel 8. Read it carefully. Circle the places in the text that you think point to the author's understanding of kingship, and reflect on this question. If this is the way that kingship is introduced, what do the Deuteronomistic historian writers think about kingship? How does this introduction to kingship prepare you to consider the stories that follow next? Then we can move ahead and look at the way that the Deuteronomistic historian has introduced us to Saul. I've listed several passages here, each of which I'd like you to stop and read carefully, doing the process again of circling places in the text that you think are most indicative of the way that the Deuteronomistic historian understood kingship in general and Saul in particular. We get, for example, in 1 Samuel 10, the anointing of Saul. And then as we move into 1 Samuel 13 and 15, we hear stories about why Saul was deemed unworthy to continue as king, why kingship was taken away from Saul. As you read these stories, what are you seeing that give you clues to the author's perspective? Literary analysis asks us to look at some particular things as good clues to what we can tell is the author's perspective. One of them is to notice the way that often characters are compared or contrasted with each other. Collins' comment on page 119 gives us a summary of how he believes that the characters of Samuel and Saul are contrasted. He claims that Samuel represents an ethic of unconditional obedience, while Saul represents a moderate pragmatism. While Collins may be talking about his own view of Samuel and Saul, notice how the contrast of those two characters would be significant to the Deuteronomistic historian. Think about what else you know about the Deuteronomistic nature of the Deuteronomistic history. How the story as a whole follows Deuteronomy to try to show that obedience is better than anything else. Or as we hear in these stories, obedience is better than sacrifice. This perhaps gets you thinking even more about how, for the Deuteronomistic historian, Samuel is shown as the model judge, whereas Saul is shown as incorrect by being a pragmatist instead of following obediently. I'd ask you to reflect on this other statement of Collins, that these chapters are clearly a theological reading of the failure of Saul's kingship. This is a really crucial point. If we're right, the Deuteronomistic history is not intended to be a simple historical record of what happened in ancient Israel, but instead a theological presentation crafted by folks during the time of Josiah and then in the exile that was trying to preach a point, to show that obedience and worship of Yahweh alone were the primary or perhaps the sole criteria by which the nation would be judged. So you might want to think about how this is a theologically oriented evaluation of Saul, of how the Deuteronomistic historian from a literary perspective is using the character of Saul in order to get across a particular theological point. See if you can answer this question for yourself. What function, what purpose does the character of Saul play in the Deuteronomistic history's theology? What does Saul seem to stand for? What is he an example of, or a negative example of, within the Deuteronomistic history's worldview? As you're thinking through that, you can then begin to prepare to move on to the character of David. But I think I'll stop this first video here and let you catch up with Saul.